So whatever it is.
That's going to go. That's going to go.
Continual notes without a single break in.
And I almost lost it there, but easy.
From the British pop revolution of the 1960s emerged an entirely new breed of musician, a post-Beatles, post-psychedelic generation that saw a future of limitless possibilities. It was time for pop music to move beyond the 3-minute love song and chart success. With little or no concern for fame, fortune, or the audience, they plundered every musical form on an adventure into uncharted territory in search of the lost chord. This is the story of that generation of new bands. Yes, King Crimson, Genesis, ELP, Jethro Tull, and many more, from the land that time forgot, the glory days of Prog Brittania. In 1967, pop music, like the world it inhabited, was about to explode. In London, the British beat boom fused with American pop in a blaze of invention that would ransack jazz, folk, and anything else it could find in the many basement clubs of the city.
I do think there are periods which are golden age. You know, the stars are aligned and whatever is happening that produces a lot of creativity.
Where I was at college, it was like a snapshot of music at the time. The agri-bot people, like the Beatles. The side I was on was blues upstairs, and in the cellar, Bob Dylan. And then you had the modern jazz guys and the classical guys.
Otis Redding and Sam and Dave and Booker T and the MGs came over, and you suddenly realise that, you know, it's game up. You can't pretend to be them anymore when they're actually here. There was some white music that even black musicians were listening to. For example, Jimi Hendrix was listening very hard to Bob Dylan, you know. There was stuff going on.
And there was, you know, huge social changes and huge chemical changes going on. There was something definitely in the water.
I mean, timing's everything. I mean, the smartest thing I did was get born in 1949. Brilliant, brilliant. Because at 18, you're in 1968. You know, Europe's aflame, the Paris riots, you know. Perfect.
I was in the States in '68, and there were 3 major assassinations while we were there. A few Kennedys and an Andy Warhol or 2, and, you know, it was all happening.
It was all happening, but much of the music only reached eager young British ears courtesy of outlaws, offshore pirate radio stations broadcasting illegally to a nation still dominated by something called the BBC Light Programme.
You know, it was unreachable. It felt like you were tuning into another planet, you know, contacting the aliens. It was coming from another world. You can only reach it, you know, on little transistor radios, late at night.
Then, in May 1967, a song that fused Bach with Percy Sledge via Bob Dylan and Geoffrey Chaucer was heard leaving for the coast. A Whiter Shade of Pale by Procol Harum.
I wouldn't be exaggerating when I said that the world was waiting for that.
We skip the light fandango, turns cartwheels across the floor.
The Beatles and the beat boom had been going for certainly 3 or 4 years. It was getting a little bit tired.
The crowd called out for more.
I wanted to do something, but I didn't want it to be like anything else, because we've had it all. This, I've never heard this before, really. That's what you think to yourself. Therefore, I like this.
When we call out for love, dream, the way to
And so it was that later, only 2 weeks later, as the miller told his tale, the Beatles released an album that was a concept, a world unto itself. A blueprint for progressive rock. A Whiter Shade of Pale topped the British singles chart the very same week that Sgt. Pepper announced the artistic triumph of the album.
Bands were still making singles, you know, Cream, Strange Brew, Pink Floyd, Arnold Lane and See Emily Play, and Procol Harum, Whiter Shade of Pale. All of these records, you know, were amazing, creative, interesting singles, and they also were incredibly commercially successful. So I mean, the bands were getting, at that moment, were getting the best of both worlds. It was Sgt. Pepper and the creative, you know, amazement of Sgt. Pepper that really convinced everybody that you can extend ideas onto an album, you can make concept albums. In fact, with the album, you can do almost exactly whatever you want.
It was a strange mixture of almost musical and totally otherworld music, you know. That was the wonderful thing about it. It bridged a gap between, you know, the real world and this other world. And the other thing, it was all totally new. You know, you never heard anything like that before.
It's more fun in the record if there's a few sounds that you don't really know what they are, and really they're just instruments, only something happens on here, you know. I couldn't tell you what, because we have a special man who sits here and goes like this. And the guitar turns into a piano or something, you know. And then you may say, why don't you use a piano? Because the piano sounds like a guitar.
If you look at the leap in terms of musical vocabulary and sophistication between the first Beatles album and Sgt. Pepper, which is like 5 years, kind of everything that could be done with that form has already been done in a way in those 5 years. Where else can you take it except to try and make it more and more sophisticated and more musically interesting, or just for rock music to kind of go on repeating itself and regurgitating itself?
If you like, there's a lot of classical music I liked.
I was always frightened of classical music, and I never wanted to listen to it because it was Beethoven and Tchaikovsky and some big words like that, and Schoenberg.
I think a lot of people started to appreciate many other genres.
Pop music is the classical music of now.
Probably the Beatles had been listening to the same stuff, smoked the same cannabis, you know, now and again.
A lot of people were smoking on the quiet, and they actually got furious when the hippies came on, because suddenly there was a lot of notice being taken, whereas they'd been quietly, you know, enjoying themselves for a long time.
This was the era when, you know, if you wanted to try something, you could, you know, you knew a mate who had some hashish, or you knew a mate who had some LSD, you know, but you had to be careful. If you were very cautious and took very little of these things, you could meddle and not lose your mind and end up in hospital.
Cannabis was a stimulant, and it did enable you to hear a lot more in the music. I mean, it was there, you weren't imagining it, it was in there, but you concentrated more on listening to it.
What came from that was the ability for people who would normally copy American music suddenly wanted to express themselves. And so you had the strange thing at that time that almost every band had a unique sound. Nobody sounded quite like anyone else.
Dynamic explosions in my brain, shatter me across the brain, falling from a yellow sky.
I moved across to what was really a new movement in music, which was the psychedelia period. And that was Arthur Brown, the crazy world of Arthur Brown. I mean, we didn't know what it was, and we were in it. What was it?
It was pretty confrontational, for that time shocking.
Arthur's concept was basically about the beginning of time, the beginning of life.
I am the god of hellfire, and I bring you...
The original for the maker was the Death Mask, which goes back right through English history and further than that.
It was kind of deep, really. It was real, you know.
Sometimes the bowl would be filled with petrol, and then the roadie would stand there throwing matches good distance away until one landed in there and we go.
The British beat boom had been a predominantly northern or working class phenomenon. But the architects of progressive rock were escapees from entirely different backgrounds.
I suppose for a rock and roller, my education was completely wrong. My mum and dad, I mean, literally did go without food to send me to piano lessons. I never found that out till many, many years on, and I went there when I was 5, and I loved it.
My family had a varied taste in music, and they were very opinionated about it. Of course, I like Cliff Richard and the Shadows, and they were going, nonsense, you won't even know who these people are next year. One day I was in this attic, and I put on this Vivaldi record or something, it was 4 Seasons or something, and I just flipped. I mean, I just went, this is fantastic stuff.
Studied Stravinsky's Dumbarton Oaks Concerto, did a lot of church music, sang in choirs. At the same time as being obsessively interested in the Shadows.
Went to the Guildhall, went to the Royal Academy, had lots of private tuition, but never really wanted to be in an orchestra, or a jazz group for that matter. I wanted to be a rock drummer.
I got a scholarship to the Royal College of Music, and I went there and I left after a year and a half. I thought, this is nuts, this whole thing. I mean, the college were really, really anti any form of music if it wasn't serious classical music.
They would either have become classical musicians, I suppose, because a lot of them had classical training degree, whatever it is, or they would have become jazzers. But the jazz scene in Britain was never that exciting. It was always such hard work.
In 66, 67, jazz was in a bad place. Jazz was free jazz. It was squeaky bum jazz, you know, kind of squeaking away. And any red-blooded drummer, age 17 at that time, would have wanted to play with Jimi Hendrix rather than the spontaneous music ensemble.
But what made pop so attractive to some inexperienced young musicians were the girls.
There's this whole other half of the human race, and like it says in Some Like It Hot, I tell you, it's a whole different sex. There was girls. Where were they? They were in cafes. What were they doing? Sitting there. What did they have? They had chalk white pink lipstick on. And I thought, I don't quite know what they're for or what you meant to do in them, but I always thought, you know, there's something great about this lot. You couldn't talk to them, but what you could do is put on a Little Richard record on the jukebox, and then it would unify the room. You couldn't put on Bartok, violin concerto. That wouldn't have impressed anybody, it wouldn't have unified the room, wouldn't have got everybody tapping their feet.
But the classical tradition had gripped a generation of rock and rollers determined to show that pop music could also be profound and grown up. In The Winter of Love, Procol Harum scored another first when they recorded an 18-minute suite in Held 'Twas in I for their album Shine On Brightly. The search for meaning and significance was on.